Speaking of for sale, the UFC Antitrust hearings have been going on. Obviously, the class action lawsuit. John Fitch involved. I think probably one of the most famous fighters involved in the case. Kung Lee as well. Jason Cruz, John Nash, and Paul Gift, an economist professor from Pepperdine University. John Nash, probably one of the smartest people in the industry, period. And Jason Cruz, who is a lawyer, I think an economist lawyer as well. They were all there at the hearings, and we're going to play a little clip from the podcast Show Money. Go check it out, SoundCloud, iTunes, all that stuff, as well as read an excerpt from Paul Gift's Forbes article. First, actually, let's read the excerpt from the article. I'll post the link in the live chat for those that maybe want to read it as well. It's a long piece. I definitely implore everyone to read it in depth because I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's just too many big words. But let's get to the part that I think is perhaps the most important part. Singer, Hal Singer, one of the plaintiffs being the fighters in the class action lawsuit, he is one of the experts on the case for them and their side. Singer acknowledges his work is out of the norm. The plaintiffs claim the UFC anti-competitively monopolized the output market for MMA events and the input market for MMA fighter services through the use of long-term exclusive fighter contracts, with the end result being suppressed fighter compensation. In a typical labor market monopolization case, one could examine actual dollar wages and attempt to see if the challenge conduct reduced compensation. That wouldn't bode well for the plaintiffs since the UFC pays more than other MMA promoters, and fighter pay has been steadily rising over the years. Instead, Singer has argued MMA is a special case where wage share should be examined rather than overall wage level, and specifically wage level being your overall pay, wage shares being how much of pay is being distributed from the owners to the employees, or in this case, independent contractors. And let's play this clip from the podcast, Show Money.
If you made it this far, you should hopefully know what the hell is going on. But if you don't, again, I'm going to bring it up the stakes in a little bit. If it passes class cert, that we can group all the fighters together, even those that haven't signed on, as one class, the 1,215 UFC fighters, into one class and sue together for a class action for all their damages together. It's a massive. Well, I just want.
Massive, you're saying? So we had to break again.
Yeah, it's a massive amount of damages potentially to the UFC. Now they could be just getting past the hurdle class cert increases the pressure on the UFC, the defendant side, to come up with some sort of settlement. Because the further it goes along, even if you're confident in your case, the further it goes along, the closer you are that, oh my God, what if you do lose? We get that much closer to the possibility we could lose, and if we lose in trial, it's triple damages, and probably even bigger is the court will apply the remedies. And remedies in this case, I think, is a big deal because who knows what the remedies here, the court is going to come to a solution of how we balance the playing field. And there was a hint in one of the reports what the plaintiffs are thinking of. And I think you missed this, though. The plaintiffs talked about, like, one thing would be like a year-long maximum contract with no options.
I think that.
Now, again, check out the whole podcast. There's multiple podcasts they did throughout the week, each day, because each day had its own hearing to examine all the evidence in the case. But to sort of, again, re-examine what was just said there and maybe rephrase it to sort of help people understand. If this goes through class action certification and we go through the court process and the plaintiffs win, the court then gets to redecide what is fair in this market, what is fair in a UFC fighter's contract. And taking that control away from the UFC would be absolutely damaging, let alone the monetary damages there would then be owed to give to all of the UFC fighters, over 1,200. And I think that is including former UFC fighters as well. Mm-hmm. So this is a massive, massive news story and potential outcome in the sport because, again, most of the framing from all these gentlemen that have been there, including guys like Josh Gross, who's been there, longtime reporter, all the framing from this last week has been the plaintiffs were largely successful. That the pure evidence they produced wasn't satisfactory for a lot of these guys, including Paul Gift, John Nash. But when it came to the hearing, apparently they were gangbusters. Like, they were just fantastic. Hal Singer, others were able to just blow away the UFC lawyers, it seems, and UFC experts in testimony. And it seems like the judge was largely on the plaintiff's side. So this case is not even close to being done. There's still large processes to be had, but a huge, seemingly, win for the plaintiffs and UFC fighters as a whole, and a huge shift towards a different paradigm completely in the UFC landscape and MMA as a whole. If UFC fighters only have a maximum of a year-long contract with multiple options at the end, I'm intrigued by this story more than probably any other right now in the MMA space. Anthony, your thoughts on the antitrust hearing and the stories coming out of it?
This is by far the most important thing going on in mixed martial arts. And it's not even close. 242 should be a fun card, and that main event means a lot and stuff, but it is nothing at all compared to this antitrust suit. So, and we're learning so much in such a short period of time that these hearings took place. Like, remember, for years, Lorenzo Fertitta was always saying, whenever he's asked the percentage of the revenue that went to the fighters, and they always say this was comparable to the NFL and Major League Baseball and all the major stick and ball sports. We thought it was a lie. We're pretty sure it was. And by far it was a lie. Like, not even close. And so this is a point that I've brought up a couple of times on the trenches. And I think it makes sense to bring this up again. When the UFC purchased Strikeforce, and they inherited those old contracts, and some of the Strikeforce fighters got rolled over into the UFC. There was a point in time where Dana White was on record complaining about how much they were getting paid, and he was saying, like, these Strikeforce guys are getting paid too much. Well, that is partly because the original owners of Strikeforce were also the owners of the San Jose Sharks. They were used to paying their athletes a certain percentage of the revenue coming in, which was on par with the other sport that they were involved in. The NHL obviously has its own union for the athletes to, argue how much they deserve to get paid of broadcasting deals and ticket sales and everything else associated with the money that's going to be generated by the team.
Video game, everything.
Exactly.
Yep.
So they had this structure already in Strikeforce, and not saying Strikeforce was a perfect promotion. Bellator is more on this line too. I think Bellator's wage share percentage was like 63% or something like that.
We can let me get to those specific wage shares because I have them up right now. First, let's get to boxing because I think that's something that was talked about in the podcast that you should go check out again. Check out the podcast because they go really in depth. Audio is not the best because they're in a bar recording it, but that does lead to some funny moments, I will say. Makes me definitely want to record in a bar more often.
Before you go on, because I'll definitely forget this point if I don't say it now. When we look at the differences in wage shares and everything, and we see the success of the UFC, you got to wonder now, and this is something that I think a lot of people didn't consider with how big the UFC is as a brand. How much of the size and scope of their brand is because they just paid the fighters less? You see so many promotions that fold. Affliction was criticized for paying these guys way too much money. They folded. And there's story after story of promotions that were told they paid too much and they folded. The UFC is here, thriving and buying out all these other promotions. So let that just be food for thought and get your noodle cooking. Continue. I'm sorry.
Let's talk about revenue shares, or I should say wage shares, specifically since that's the legal term that's being used. John Nash reporting some of the numbers that have come out from the hearing. Golden Boy's numbers, 62%. Top Rank, 71%. Something called Warriors, I haven't heard about that, 65.4%. Lou DiBella is saying 60% is common. Top Rank's yearly revenue split, 67% 2013, 68% 2014, 69% 2015, 80% in 2016. And that coincides with the ESPN deal as well. Massive number there. Bellator's numbers, 2014, 74%. 2012, 70%. 2013, 76%. 2014, massive dip, 30%. 2015, even more massive dip, negative 33%. I don't know how that's possible that the owners or the executives take more money than the fighters make in 2015. In 2016, you have 30%. 2017 and 2019, annual 64%. And 2020 projection, 25% dip. So numbers all over the place for Bellator, but overall significantly better than what we see for the UFC. This is a graph that's been compiled from the numbers from the hearing from John Nash. The numbers were at 40% in the early 2000s and then dipped all the way to just hovering over 10% in 2005. Coincides with the Spike deal, the Ultimate Fighter, just massive revenue gains for the UFC. Also, massive revenue disparity between and wage disparity between the fighters and the executives. And that number kind of stagnated and didn't go. It hit around mid-20s in the late 2000s, late aughts, so to speak, and it just hovered around 20% all the way through. Now, the revenue split for pay-per-view numbers, because Jay's asking me down in the chat, it was a little bit higher. It was around 30 to 40%. I don't have those numbers in front of me right now. I apologize. But I know those numbers are available in one of these podcasts. So check them out. But overall, if you look at especially boxing, because the boxing is the one I use, the comparison I use for a market reference more than anything, a market benchmark, to use the term that the judge used in the hearing, a benchmark that he wanted. And the UFC attorneys weren't able to give one, a benchmark to what a model looks like that has these types of wage shares. And the UFC attorneys could not give one. But if you look at boxing, it's significantly different, where it's around, like what Lou DiBella says, the average is 70%. And if that's the average in boxing, and the average in MMA is significantly lower across the board, even though Bellator has some good years, it is still significantly lower than, I would say, what boxing is. Something is wrong there, significantly wrong there.
Well, I mean, let's examine though what could kind of skew those numbers for boxing. I mean, first let's acknowledge that the Ali Act has something to do with what's going on, because the fighters have a little more leeway as far as what they can do and getting locked into long contracts and whatnot.
Absolutely. Yes.
And one thing that the UFC and other MMA promotions have benefited from is having in-house rankings. And they're able to decide who gets title shots and whatnot, as opposed to having independent sanctioning bodies decide upon that for the promoters. So there's a level of control in that sense with the Ali Act. But then also too, some boxers are paid so much money that those numbers have to get skewed. When you're talking about, you're throwing tens of millions of dollars at Canelo or but then Deontay Wilder or something like that.
Yeah, but then we look at like individual events, and I'll try to find them really fast. But I know that we had like individual events, like certain George St. Pierre pay-per-view events. We had specific revenue information on certain Brock Lesnar events. It was still, compared to boxing, demonstrably lower in terms of wage share. Like even the big names for UFC are getting underpaid comparative to boxing. So of course it's getting skewed. I think when you take out big names, the number drops significantly in boxing. But even with the big names in UFC, the number is still significantly low. That's the point. Like even the big names are getting significantly underpaid. And honestly, that's where you're going to see this huge percentage discrepancy is with those big names, because those big names are making so much more dollars in boxing comparative to MMA and the UFC.
Yeah, and
So your point's correct, but that doesn't take away from
agreed.
What is the issue here? That's what
and I also would like to cite something you brought up that kind of rose the anger of a particular MMA manager out there, where you were talking about Jones guaranteed pay for UFC 232. I think this was Cyborg's guaranteed pay as well.
Yes,
$500,000 for 232.
Yes,
I want to say Nunes was guaranteed 350,000.
Yes, she was.
I'm not mistaken.
Yes, she was.
So you were pointing out those numbers and saying, hey, this pay-per-view was reported to sell like 8,500,000 buys, just something along. It was
like 700,000. It was a really good number. It was a healthy number for sure.
All right, and showing their guaranteed money as opposed to what Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury made guaranteed for their fight, which sold about half that.
Yeah,
big difference, very, very big difference, and guaranteed money is where it's at. Just like when we look at NFL contracts and we see like this guy signed for 8 years for $120 million. That sounds fantastic, but that $120 million is incentivized. There's a lot of other things involved there other than just showing up and playing. The guaranteed money is where it's at. So if your guaranteed is that low when you're selling that many pay-per-views, there is a problem.
Here we go. Here's the number that you would like to know, because it is significantly lower, which isn't surprising because we know that payouts for boxers on undercards is criminal. It's downright criminal. John Nash, according to data Golden Boy provides, they made $55 million in 2016 and paid boxers $7.8 million, 14%. Zimbalist, I think that's one of the lawyers, pointed out this doesn't seem to include Canelo's $27 million, which would bring the share up to 63%. So that's where you get that big increase to where you get more in the 60s to 70 percentile for boxing wage shares. Jay trolling me in the chat. Hilarious. I'm trying to find that George St. Pierre one because that one was sad. I remember seeing that and going, oh, George, you got screwed over big time, because George was like a guy that was doing million buys, 800,000, 700,000 buys consistently. He was getting paid $2-3 million in back end money. Like, that's nothing. Like, there's guys on Showtime right now in boxing that do 400,000, 500,000 viewers get paid that.
Yeah, like I think of a guy like Tank Davis.
Yep.
Like, how much money is he pulling in? And he's
Danny Garcia.
Or Adrian Bronner. Think about the money that he's pulling in, although he flushes it down the toilet, like literally flushes it down the toilet if you've ever seen his trash Instagram. But yeah, man, like there is a problem. There's a big problem across the board, really.